My husband said you were never meant to stand beside me. Pack your things. I nodded. Of course. Welcome to her revenge. Here's a story that changed everything.
My husband said you were never meant to stand beside me. Pack your things. I nodded. Of course. He thought he had built everything, so I walked away quietly. But what he didn't know, every deal, every connection was mine. And the moment I left, everything he owned started falling apart. Before we go further, if this story is already pulling at something in you, I am genuinely grateful you are here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your country? Your city? I read every single one, and it means more than you know. A small note: this story contains fictional elements woven in for depth and reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but everything it asks you to feel is worth feeling. The most dangerous woman in the room is the one nobody thinks to look at. I spent 5 years being that woman. I did it on purpose, and I did it for love. That was my first mistake. The conference room at Daly and Reed Capital occupied the entire northeast corner of the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Nashville into something that looked almost too beautiful to be real. On a clear January evening, the lights of the city spread out below, like something scattered there deliberately, the kind of view that made people feel important just by standing in front of it. Garrett had chosen this office for exactly that reason. I knew that because I was the one who had suggested the building. I was sitting in the chair closest to the door, not at the table beside it, slightly back in the particular position that communicates one thing without a word being spoken. She's just here with him. The table was long and glass and reflected the city lights in a way that made everything look doubled, everything look like more than it was. There were 4 men at that table. Garrett sat at the head. 2 attorneys flanked the client. A man named Douglas Hale, who ran a regional logistics company out of Brentwood and who had spent the better part of 18 months being courted by every mid-size financial firm in Tennessee. Douglas Hale had chosen Daly and Reed Capital. He had chosen it because 6 months ago, a mutual connection, one that traced back through 3 handshakes to a woman sitting quietly beside the door, had mentioned that Garrett Daly was the sharpest emerging voice in Nashville's private capital space. That mutual connection had not happened by accident. Nothing in this room had happened by accident. But you would not have known that from watching the signing. Douglas signed first, then passed the pen to Garrett. The room shifted the way rooms do when something significant becomes official, a collective exhale, a loosening of shoulders, the particular energy of men who have gotten what they wanted. Garrett accepted the congratulations the way he had learned to accept them over the past few years, graciously, with a kind of practiced humility that looked almost genuine if you didn't know him well. "You've built something remarkable here," Douglas said, shaking Garrett's hand with both of his. "The growth numbers alone 3 years ago, who would have predicted this? We've had the right opportunities at the right time," Garrett said. He had his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his collar open just enough to read as confident rather than careless. He looked like a man who had earned something. "And the right team around me. The right team." I turned that phrase over quietly in my mind. I looked at my hands in my lap. I was wearing a watch I had owned for 11 years, nothing remarkable. Because nothing I wore in rooms like this was ever remarkable. That was the point. The attorneys began organizing the documents. Someone refilled Douglas's water glass. Garrett laughed at something Douglas said, an easy laugh, unhurried. The laugh of a man completely at home in his own success. I watched it all with the same pleasant, neutral expression I had spent years perfecting. Present enough to be polite, invisible enough to be forgotten. Outside in the hallway, if you happened to walk past the glass partition, you might have noticed a woman in her early 60s sitting with perfect posture in one of the chairs near the elevator bank, a leather folio on her lap, not looking at her phone. That was Agatha. She had been with me long enough that she knew to wait without being told how long. The meeting wrapped at 8:15. Douglas shook hands with the attorneys, then turned to Garrett for a final word. He glanced in my direction once, not unkindly, just briefly. The way people glance at furniture that is well chosen but not the point of the room. Your wife? He asked Garrett as an afterthought. Celeste, Garrett said. She likes to tag along sometimes. He smiled at me. I smiled back. Tag along. I had sourced the contact who introduced them. I had reviewed the pitch deck Garrett presented and quietly flagged the 3 projections that were overreached, which he corrected without knowing why they'd felt wrong to him. I had spent 4 months working a particular thread through my own network, until it led, inevitably, to Douglas Hale deciding that Daly and Reed was worth a serious conversation. And I had done all of it from a position of such complete invisibility that the man sitting at the head of the table, the man whose name was on the building directory downstairs, genuinely believed that tonight was entirely his. I tag along. The ride home took 20 minutes. Garrett drove, which he always did after a good night, because he liked the control of it, the physical expression of momentum. He talked through the details of the deal terms, timelines, what it would mean for the firm's positioning going into the second quarter. I listened and responded at the right moments, the way you do when you have heard this particular kind of conversation many times before and know exactly what it needs from you. We were on Hillsborough Pike, 2 miles from home when it happened. He had been talking about expansion plans, about what this contract would unlock, about what he might finally be able to afford to do with the downtown office space he'd been watching for 2 years. He was in a good mood, the kind that makes some people generous and made Garrett, sometimes carelessly honest. You know, he said, without taking his eyes off the road, you should really think about picking up some additional certifications, something to sharpen your profile. You're smart, Celeste, but the work you're doing, honestly, the ceiling is pretty low. He said it the way people say things they've been thinking for a while, not cruelly, just matter-of-factly. The way you'd observe that a car needs an oil change. Some women are just built for the back seat. There's nothing wrong with that. Nashville in January slid past the passenger window. The bare branches of the trees along the boulevard at the warm yellow rectangles of houses already settling in for the evening. I looked at all of it. You're probably right, I said. I said it the way I had learned to say things I had no intention of meaning, smoothly, without weight, just enough agreement to close a subject without opening another. Garrett nodded, satisfied, and changed the subject to a restaurant he wanted to try in East Nashville. I watched the road. I counted the turns until we reached home. He went upstairs without asking about my evening. I heard the bedroom door close, and then the muffled sound of the television, the 11 o'clock segment of the business channel. He fell asleep to every night, the one that recapped the day's market activity in a tone designed to be reassuring. I sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in the particular way that large houses are quiet when only part of them is occupied. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the phone. Not the one Garrett had ever seen me use, not the one that sat on the charger in our bedroom, but the one I kept for a single, specific purpose. The screen was dark. I turned it on. One message. The sender was listed only as RC. Everything is in position. Your move. I looked at those 5 words for a moment. Then I typed my reply. 3 words sent at 11:22 on a Tuesday night in January. From a woman sitting alone at her kitchen table in Belle Meade, while her husband watched television upstairs. Monday, we go. I set the phone face down on the table. I got up, filled a glass of water at the sink, and stood there drinking it slowly, looking out at the backyard where the winter grass had gone gray and still. Somewhere in the city, a woman named Rosalind Crane had just read my message. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. I knew exactly what I had set in motion. I rinsed the glass, dried it, put it back in the cabinet where it belonged. Then I went upstairs to bed. Let me tell you what my husband thought he knew about me, and then let me tell you what was actually true. The distance between those 2 things is where this entire story lives. What Garrett knew, I was Celeste Hartwell, 37 years old, working a mid-level administrative position at a property management firm in Green Hills. Reliable income, nothing remarkable. A woman with strong opinions about Nashville's restaurant scene, and almost no opinions as far as he could tell about anything that happened in a boardroom. What was actually true, I was the sole operating CEO of Hartwell Group, a privately held conglomerate with controlling stakes in 15 companies across 4 states. $2.3 billion in consolidated assets, give or take depending on the quarter. My father, Edmund Hartwell, built the foundation in the early 1980s with a single commercial real estate acquisition in East Nashville. Back when betting on that part of the city was considered optimistic at best. He was 30 years old, working with borrowed money, and more certain about Nashville's future than anyone around him. He was right. He was right about most things, which was occasionally difficult, and ultimately one of the greatest gifts of my life. Edmund had a philosophy he repeated often enough that it became something close to a family religion: wealth that announces itself invites enemies. Wealth that stays quiet builds empires. He meant it structurally. Hartwell Group's companies operated under names that contained no trace of the word Hartwell. Our real estate holdings ran through limited liability companies with names that sounded like small regional developers. Our logistics arm kept the original name of the company Edmund first acquired deliberately boring, deliberately forgettable. The result was that a person could move through Nashville's business circles for years, recognize the Hartwell name in passing, and never once connect it to the woman sitting quietly across the dinner table. I took over operational leadership in the spring of 2014 at 29. Edmund had been preparing me since I was 19, board discussions, early operational roles, a Vanderbilt finance degree followed by an MBA I completed in 14 months. The morning I signed the papers formalizing my role, he made coffee the same way he had made it every morning of my childhood, strong, black, unhurried, and said simply, "Take care of what we built." I told him I would. I meant it completely. Over the next 4 years, I grew the portfolio from 4 companies to 15, the asset base from under $400 million to $2.3 billion. None of it was public. All of it was real. The only person who moved through both versions of my life, the visible one, and the actual one without needing anything explained, was Agatha Pemberton. She came to work for me in 2011 when I was 26, arriving at our first meeting with a leather folio and the quiet authority of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by titles. She interviewed me as much as I interviewed her. She has been the most consistently valuable person in my professional life in the 14 years since, and she has never once said a word about Hartwell Group to anyone I had not explicitly authorized. She was in every meaningful sense the person who held the architecture together while I built it. The loneliness of that kind of life is hard to explain without sounding ungrateful. I was not unhappy. But there is a specific isolation that comes from being known only partially by almost everyone around you, and I had lived inside it long enough that I had stopped feeling its edges. Every relationship I had attempted before 2018 had collapsed around the same fault line. I could never be certain whether the person across the table wanted me or wanted what I represented. I had ended one engagement, a man who was kind and perceptive, and ultimately more interested in what the Hartwell name could do for his firm than in the person carrying it. That ending had been correct. It had left a residue I was still carrying. I want to be invisible, for once I told my father one evening in the fall of 2017. We were in his study, old books, coffee, the particular quiet of a house that had held a family for decades. Just once I want someone to see me without the name, without the portfolio. Just me. Edmund set down his cup. You can hide your name, Celeste. You cannot hide who you are. The right person will see you anyway, and the wrong person will use the silence against you. I heard him. I filed it in the part of my mind reserved for things I knew were probably true and wasn't ready to act on. I had 37 years of being Celeste Hartwell before I walked into the Vanderbilt Alumni Gala on a Thursday evening in April of 2018. I had no idea I was about to hand someone the most expensive thing I owned, my trust, without reading the terms and conditions first. The alumni gala at Vanderbilt drew the kind of crowd that knew how to fill a room without appearing to try. The venue was one of the university's older reception halls, the kind with coffered ceilings and enough square footage that the jazz quartet in the far corner sounded like something you were discovering rather than something being performed at you. Champagne moved through the room on silver trays. The flowers were white and expensive and smelled exactly right. Everyone was dressed the way Nashville money dresses well, but not loudly. Because the loudest people in that city are almost never the ones who actually have something. I had been to this particular event 3 times before. I knew how it worked. I knew which conversations to engage and which to exit gracefully, which faces to remember and which names to let go. I had attended all 3 previous years with what I can only describe as professional competence, present, pleasant, unremarkable. My standard operating mode in rooms I had not chosen to command. Wren Callahan had been my closest friend since our second year at Vanderbilt, which meant she had known me through every version of myself I had cycled through in the 17 years since. She was the only person outside my family and Agatha who knew what I actually did for a living. She had held that information for years with the same careless ease she held everything lightly, without drama, because Wren fundamentally understood that some things are simply not hers to share. That evening, she was in a green dress that suited her, and carrying a glass of white wine she had no intention of finishing, which was also very Wren. We were standing near the windows that overlooked the courtyard when I noticed him. He was positioned near the jazz quartet, which was either a genuine preference for live music or a very good instinct about where to stand close enough to the action to seem engaged, far enough from the main networking current to appear unhurried. He was talking to 2 men I vaguely recognized from the commercial banking sector, and he was doing it with the relaxed confidence of someone who had decided years ago that rooms like this one were not obstacles to be navigated, but simply spaces to move through. He wore a dark jacket over an open collar. Nothing flashy. He looked in the specific way that certain men managed to look like he belonged exactly where he was. I noticed him for approximately 4 seconds before I looked away. That was more than I usually gave anyone. He made his way across the room about 20 minutes later. Not directly, he stopped twice, spoke briefly with 2 different groups, laughed at something someone said. By the time he was standing in front of me, he had the particular ease of a man who had simply ended up here, rather than one who had worked toward it. The distinction I would learn was meaningless, but it was effective. His name was Garrett Daly. He ran a financial advisory firm called Daly and Reed Capital, he said, here in Nashville, on the smaller side, but growing in the right direction. He had graduated 3 years ahead of me, which explained why we had not crossed paths before. He asked questions that were interested without being intrusive, and answered mine with just enough detail to be satisfying and not enough to be exhausting. He was in the plainest terms very good at this. After about 20 minutes, Wren touched my arm lightly and tilted her head toward the terrace. We excused ourselves. Outside, the April air was cool and carried the faint smell of the magnolias along Alumni Lawn. Wren waited until we were out of earshot. "I don't like the way he watches you when you're not looking at him," she said. I had to think about that for a moment. "He's interested," I said. "That's exactly what I mean." Wren looked back through the glass doors toward the reception. "Too interested. Too soon. There's something very deliberate about it." I considered this and then let it go the way I let go things that disrupted a feeling I was enjoying. He was attentive. That was different from deliberate. At least, that was what I told myself standing on that terrace with the magnolia smell in the air and the jazz carrying faintly through the closed doors. We went back inside. Garrett found me again near the end of the evening, close to when the crowd was beginning to thin. We talked for another 30 minutes, and at some point he said something that I have thought about many times since, in the way you return to a thing when you finally understand what it was actually made of. "You're the only person I've talked to tonight who isn't performing," he said. "Everyone else in this room is selling something. "You're just here." I did not recognize it then for what it was. How could I? It was the most perfectly calibrated thing a person could say to a woman who had spent years wondering whether anyone would ever actually see her, without the architecture she had built around herself getting in the way. It landed exactly where it was aimed. And the bitter, exquisite irony of it, which I only understood years later, was that the man delivering those words was the most practiced performer in that entire room. He had simply chosen a different stage. I drove home that night thinking about the way a good sentence can make you feel briefly certain of something you have been uncertain about for a long time. My phone buzzed on the nightstand as I was getting ready for bed. Ren at 11:47. I looked him up. Daly and Reed is smaller than he made it sound. "Call me before you see him again." I read it. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I turned off the lamp. I did not call her. I told myself it was because there was nothing to call about yet. No reason to make something out of a single conversation at a gala. But the truth, which I am capable of admitting now, is that I did not want to hear what she would say. That was mistake number 2. 14 months. That is how long I let myself believe it. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not ashamed of that. Loving someone who turns out to be wrong for you is not weakness. It is just the most expensive tuition some of us ever pay. The first months were genuinely good. I want to say that plainly without qualification because it matters to the story. Garrett Daly was not a simple man to dismiss. He remembered details, the name of a colleague I had mentioned once in passing a restaurant. I had said I wanted to try the particular coffee order I gave without thinking. He had a dry, unhurried humor that caught me off guard in the way only genuinely funny people can. And he listened. Not the performed listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind. The kind where you can feel that your words are landing somewhere and being held. We had dinners at the Catbird seat where the tasting menu changed every season and required reservations made weeks in advance. He always had them. We walked along the Cumberland River on Sunday mornings when Nashville was still quiet enough to hear the water. We drove down to Franklin one weekend and to Chattanooga another. And on the long stretches of highway between places, he would ask questions that made me feel in the most disarming way like someone worth being curious about. I was not performing with him. That was the thing. In most rooms, most conversations, there was a version of me running slightly ahead of the actual me, anticipating, positioning, managing. With Garrett in those first months, that version went quiet. I did not know whether to be grateful for that or afraid of it. For a long time, I chose grateful. I helped him without telling him. That is the part I have thought about most in the years since. Through Agatha, I arranged introductions, a logistics executive who needed financial advisory services, and happened to mention it in a conversation with someone who happened to know someone. A referral that found its way to Daly and Reed through 4 degrees of separation, none of which could be traced back to me. I reviewed the quarterly projections he mentioned over dinner one night, and identified, without saying so directly, that 2 of the assumptions were going to create problems by year 3. I framed it as a question the way you do when you know the answer and want the other person to arrive at it themselves. He adjusted the projections. He told his partner it was his own instinct. I said nothing. I told myself I was being supportive. I told myself it was what you did when you cared about someone's success. Both of those things were true. What I did not tell myself then was that I was also making myself indispensable in a way that left no trace. Ren had gone quiet on the subject of Garrett after the first month or so, which I recognized as her version of diplomacy. She asked about him the way you ask about the weather in a city you are not visiting politely without investment. My mother Elspeth met him at a family dinner in the fall of 2018, about 6 months into our relationship. She was gracious in the way she was always gracious, attentive, warm. The kind of hostess who made people feel that her home had been arranged specifically for their comfort. She asked Garrett the right questions and laughed at the right moments and afterward. When I was helping her clear the table while Garrett was in the other room with my father, she put her hand briefly on my arm and looked at me in a way that said something she did not say out loud. I asked her later what that look had meant. She said she was just glad I seemed happy. I believed her because I wanted to. The questions started around month 8. Small ones at first folded into conversations about Nashville's business community in the way that curious people fold things into conversation. He wanted to know how my family had built their network over the years, which events they found worthwhile, which relationships had been most valuable, how the Hartwell name carried in certain circles. He asked with the tone of someone asking about a family tradition, interested, appreciative, not acquisitive. I answered the way I always answered questions about my family, carefully, generally warmly, but without detail. I told myself he was asking because he was serious about me, because he wanted to understand where I came from. That was one possible interpretation. Edmund met Garrett for the first time in early spring of 2019, 3 months before the wedding. They shook hands in the front hallway of my parents' house, and my father said exactly the right things, measured, civil, genuinely cordial. Garrett was at his best that evening. He was engaged and respectful, and asked my father thoughtful questions about Nashville's growth corridors in the 80s, which was exactly the kind of topic Edmund could discuss for an hour without effort. My father called me that night at 10:15. He asked me 3 questions about Hartwell Group this evening, Edmund said. His voice was even careful. Not one of them was about you. I didn't say anything right away. I'm just telling you what I noticed, he said. The rest is yours to decide. We said goodnight. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, turning the conversation over the way you turn something over when you already know what it means and are not ready to know it yet. The next morning, an arrangement of white peonies arrived at my door, my favorite flower, which I had mentioned exactly once in passing, 4 months earlier, with a handwritten card that said he had been thinking about me since he left. The handwriting was careful. The gesture was perfect. I put the flowers in a vase on the kitchen windowsill and let the phone call slide to the back of my mind, where I kept things I was not ready to look at directly. That evening, Garrett called and asked if I wanted to take a walk. We ended up at Centennial Park as the sun was going down the Parthenon replica, casting long shadows across the lawn, the reflecting pool catching the last of the light. We had been walking for about 20 minutes when he stopped and turned toward me. The ring was simple and exactly right, a single stone clean setting, nothing that announced itself too loudly. I remember thinking in the fraction of a second before everything else that he must have spent a great deal of time choosing it, that it was precisely calibrated to what he understood about me. I looked into his eyes and I saw what I wanted to see. That is the honest answer. I said yes. Somewhere across town, I imagined my father sat down in his armchair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. My father wore his best suit to my wedding. He walked me down the aisle with his hand steady and his face composed. He did not cry during the ceremony. He did not cry at the reception. Bennett told me 2 years later that he found our father sitting alone in his car in the parking lot at 11:15 that night. Not crying exactly, but not crying either. My father would hate that I am telling you this, but it is the most honest thing I know about that day. We were married on a Saturday afternoon in mid-June in the garden of my parents' home in Belmead. 24 people. The guest list had been my idea, small, intentional. No one in that garden who was not someone we actually wanted there. The Tennessee heat had softened by late afternoon into something almost gentle, and the light came through the old oak trees at the angle it only reaches in June golden, and unhurried, the kind of light that makes everything look like it was planned. I had not wanted a large wedding. Garrett had deferred to me on that as he deferred to me on most aesthetic decisions, which I had taken as attentiveness, and which I now understand was simply efficiency. A small ceremony meant fewer people to perform for. He was very good at performing, but even the best performances have a finite range. The ceremony itself was short. We had written our own vows, which felt meaningful at the time, and which I have not been able to read since. Edmund walked me down the makeshift aisle between 2 rows of white chairs, and just before we reached the end, just before he would let go of my arm and step back, he squeezed my hand once. Not gently, firmly, the way you hold on to something you are about to release and cannot say out loud that you wish you weren't. I understood everything in that one squeeze. I did not let myself look at him. Ren stood to my left throughout the ceremony in a pale blue dress she had chosen herself, which told me she had thought carefully about what the day required of her. She smiled every time I glanced at her. Her eyes were red at the edges in a way she was clearly hoping I would not notice. I noticed. I did not ask. Some kindnesses are best left unremarked. My brother Bennett, 4 years older than me, the kind of steady, plain-spoken presence that family systems quietly depend on, stood near the back, with his wife during the ceremony. I caught his eye once. He gave me a small nod that contained, as Bennett's small nods usually do, more than it appeared to. He did not say anything to me about Garrett that day. He would not say anything to me about Garrett for another 3 years. Bennett operates on the principle that a person has to arrive at certain truths themselves, and that the only thing worse than watching someone make a mistake is making them feel foolish for it afterward. Garrett was, I will say this honestly, extraordinary that afternoon. He remembered the names of every person there. He spoke to Edmund for 20 minutes about the history of commercial development along the Charlotte Pike corridor, which was precisely the kind of conversation my father found genuinely interesting. And he did it without notes, without prompting, because he had prepared. He made Elspeth laugh twice during the cocktail hour, real laughter, the kind that surprised her, and he shook hands with every one of my cousins with the full attention of a man who had been waiting specifically to meet them. Edmund watched all of it from a slight distance, the way he watches things he is still forming an opinion about. Elspeth watched with a kind of careful warmth. Bennett watched without appearing to watch, which is a skill he developed young and has never lost. Nobody said anything. It was my wedding day. Agatha had come. I had not expected her to, and I had not asked. I had simply sent an invitation because she was one of the 24 people I actually wanted there. She did not sit at the table I had assigned her. I spotted her during the reception, standing near the French doors that opened onto the garden, a glass of water in her hand, dressed simply and well. She watched the room the way she watched most things, completely without appearing to. Her eyes found Garrett regularly. I noticed that too. The last guests left a little after 10. My parents' home emptied in the gradual, warm-hearted way that good parties end, with long goodbyes and promises to call, and the particular tiredness that comes from a day of feeling things fully. Edmund hugged me at the door. He held on a beat longer than usual. He said, "Take care of yourself," which is not a thing he says casually. Later that night, in the quiet of the bedroom in the Belle Meade house that was now ours, Garrett sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me in the low light and said, "You know what I love most about you? You've never needed to prove anything to anyone." I thought it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me. He loved that I was not ambitious in the visible way. He loved that I did not compete, did not position, did not require a stage. He loved that I was in his careful assessment safe. A woman without sharp edges. A woman who would not see him coming. It took me 3 years to understand what he was actually saying. I woke the next morning to an empty bed. Through the window I could hear Garrett's voice in the backyard, low phone focus, the clipped tone he used for business. I sat up, checked the time. 6:47. Our first morning as a married couple. I went downstairs and made coffee. I was standing at the kitchen counter, still in the previous night's robe, when I heard a quiet knock at the side door. Agatha. She was dressed as if she had already been somewhere, and returned, which, knowing her, she likely had. She came in without needing to be asked, sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and after a moment she reached across and put her hand over mine. "I will watch him," she said quietly. "Every day. You will not need to ask me to. You will not even need to know that I am doing it. I will just watch. I looked at her. 12 years she had been with me. 12 years of knowing things and saying nothing, and being exactly where she was needed before she was asked. I did not ask her why she felt the need to say this on the morning after my wedding. Some things you understand without needing them explained. Okay, I said. Just that. Okay. Outside, Garrett's voice continued in the backyard, easy and unhurried, as if the day had already started without either of us. For 2.5 years, I was the most powerful, invisible woman in Nashville. I moved pieces on a board Garrett did not know existed in a game he did not know he was playing. I did it because I loved him. That is the part that still costs me something when I think about it, not the time, not the energy I spent. The fact that it was real. The work itself was not complicated, at least not in the way that visible work is complicated. It required no meetings with my name on the calendar, no emails that could be traced, no presence that anyone could point to afterward. What it required was patience, discretion, and the particular advantage of knowing exactly which doors opened onto which rooms. The first significant move came 4 months into our marriage. One of Hartwell Group's logistics partners, a man who ran a regional freight operation out of Murfreesboro and needed to restructure his company's capital advisory relationship, was introduced. Through a mutual acquaintance who was introduced through another mutual acquaintance to a promising young firm in Nashville called Daly and Reed Capital. The chain of introductions was clean. None of it pointed back to me. Garrett landed the client and told me over dinner that his reputation was starting to travel, that the right people were beginning to pay attention. I told him that was wonderful. I meant it at the time in the complicated way that you mean things when you have engineered them, but still want them to be real. Over the following 18 months, similar things happened 5 more times. A healthcare group looking to restructure its investment portfolio. A commercial real estate developer expanding into the Gulch corridor who needed someone with specific regional knowledge. Each connection moved through enough degrees of separation that no reasonable person could have traced it. Each one landed at Daly and Reed as if by the natural gravity of merit and reputation. In between, I listened. This was the part Garrett never accounted for, that the woman sitting across the dinner table from him every night, the one who asked questions about his work with what seemed like genuine but unspecialized interest, was processing every answer through a frame of reference considerably larger than he knew. When he mentioned that his projections for year 3 were feeling ambitious, I asked a few questions, and then said casually that I had always found it interesting how small changes in assumed growth rates could compound unexpectedly. He adjusted his numbers the next day. He told his business partner it had come to him in the shower. Agatha coordinated the logistics of all of it. She was the one who identified which of Hartwell Group's network contacts were positioned to make natural introductions, who verified that the paper trail was clean, who made sure nothing moved faster than could be explained by ordinary good fortune. She sent me brief updates on the encrypted phone, a name, a date, a confirmation, and I responded in kind. We never discussed it at length. We did not need to. The results were not subtle. Daly and Reed Capital grew 340% over 30 months, which in the financial advisory sector in a mid-sized southern city is the kind of number that makes people take notice. New clients expanded services a second higher, then a third. Then a move to a larger office in the Gulch with floor-to-ceiling windows and a conference room that could seat 16. Nashville Business Journal ran a profile. Garrett was quoted saying that he had always believed in the power of building relationships before you needed them. I read that quote at the kitchen table one morning over my coffee and did not say anything. The change in him was not sudden. That is the important thing to understand. It did not happen the way a light switch happens. It happened the way erosion happens, gradually, imperceptibly. One small displacement at a time, until one day you look at the landscape and realize it no longer resembles what it was. The dinners grew quieter, not uncomfortably, so not at first, just less animated. The conversation narrowing from the wide range it had once covered to a smaller circuit of his work, his deals, his assessment of people he had met that week. When I offered observations, they were received with the particular half-attention of someone who has already formed a conclusion. When I asked questions, they were answered briefly as if the question itself was a slight interruption. He started coming home later. Not dramatically late, an extra hour, sometimes two, explained by client dinners or late meetings or the general demands of a growing firm, all of which were plausible enough that I accepted them without examination because I was not yet in the business of examining. There were evenings when I had dinner alone and cleaned up alone and was already in bed before I heard the front door. There were mornings when he left before I was fully awake, and the house was already empty by the time I came downstairs. The comments arrived without apparent intention, the way small cruelties often do. A remark about the modest scale of my supposed job at the property management firm. A comparison, drawn lightly and with no apparent malice, between my professional trajectory and that of someone else's wife, someone who had built something. An observation, delivered from behind his phone one evening, that some people were better suited to supporting roles. Each one landed and dissolved before I could quite hold it, the way a paper cut disappears before you have finished registering the sting. I told myself it was pressure. I told myself that growth at that rate was stressful, that ambition had costs, that the man I had married was still in there somewhere under the accumulated weight of success. I told myself this for longer than I should have. The Nashville Business Awards ceremony was held on a Thursday evening in October of 2021 at the Schermerhorn Symphony Center downtown. Daly and Reed Capital had been nominated for Fastest Growing Financial Firm in Tennessee, a category they won. Garrett wore a navy suit. I wore a dress I had chosen to be quietly appropriate and absolutely unmemorable, which was, I realize now, a costume I had been wearing for years. He spoke for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I counted not because I meant to, but because my mind needed somewhere to go, while I sat at the front table with my hands in my lap. He thanked his business partner. He thanked 3 clients by name. He thanked the city of Nashville for being, in his words, the kind of place that rewards people who are willing to put in the work. He did not mention me. I sat in that room and I clapped with everyone else, and I smiled when the people at our table looked at me, because that was what the moment required. And I thought, with a clarity I had not let myself reach before I had helped build everything he was standing up there taking credit for. And I was sitting in the audience applauding, because that is what you do when you love someone. You celebrate their success even when it used to be yours. The ride home was celebratory. He opened a good bottle of wine, a Napa Cabernet he had been saving for something worth saving it for. He poured 2 glasses and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the particular brightness of a man who had just received public confirmation of what he already believed about himself. To us, he said, lifting his glass. Just getting started. I heard the word us, the way you hear a word in a foreign language that you almost but do not quite speak close enough to seem familiar, far enough to remain slightly out of reach. I lifted my glass. I drank. Later that night, after he had gone upstairs, I sat at the table a while longer with my second glass and the quiet. The city was doing what it always does outside those windows, indifferent, continuous, completely unaware that anything particular had happened in any given room. The encrypted phone vibrated against the table. Agatha. 3 lines. Third-party transfers. December. Something is wrong. Come in tomorrow morning. Do not mention this tonight. I looked at those lines for a moment. Then I set the phone down, finished my wine, rinsed the glass, and went upstairs. I did not sleep well. The morning Agatha Pemberton came to my office without texting first, I knew it wasn't about a scheduling conflict. She arrived at 7:14 a.m. before the building's main elevators were unlocked, using the side stairwell key only 3 people in the world had. I was already there, coffee half gone, reviewing quarterly returns for a subsidiary in Memphis. When I heard her knock 3 short, deliberate taps, something in my chest shifted before I even stood up. Agatha had worked beside me for 12 years. I had seen her handle a board mutiny without raising her voice. I had seen her manage a hostile acquisition attempt with the calm of someone filing routine paperwork. But that Tuesday morning in January, her hands were not steady. She set her leather portfolio on my desk and opened it without sitting down. "I've checked it 3 times," she said. I wanted to be wrong. She wasn't. What Agatha placed in front of me was 47 pages of transfer records cross-referenced against Daily and Reed Capital's client fund statements. Over the course of 14 months, April 2020 through June 2021, overlapping almost exactly with the period I had worked hardest to build, Garrett's firm, someone had moved money. Not in large, attention-grabbing amounts, but in careful, practiced increments. 47 transfers, each one designed to stay below federal reporting thresholds, each one landing in the same Delaware-registered shell company, a company with no employees, no website, and no declared business activity. Total amount moved $4,700,000. I read the number twice. The transfers were deliberate. Agatha said, her voice steady now that the documents were out. Whoever did this knew exactly where the monitoring gaps were. This wasn't improvised. I didn't say anything. I kept reading. The shell company had no traceable owner on the surface. Agatha had gone 2 layers deeper, the kind of work that took days, not hours. On the 3rd page, she had circled a name in pencil. A fund account registered to a secondary entity. Typed in a column of financial codes almost invisible was a single line Drummond L. I didn't recognize it. I looked up at Agatha. "I don't know who that is yet," she said. I nodded and looked back at the page. I want to tell you that I reacted the way the situation deserved, that I stood up or raised my voice or called someone immediately. But I didn't. I stood and walked to the window, and I looked out over the gulch where Nashville was beginning its Tuesday morning at a normal pace. Delivery trucks, coffee shop lines, people who were not sitting inside the information that the man sleeping in their bed had spent 14 months methodically stealing from his own clients. 3 years. That was the number I kept returning to. Not the dollar amount, not the 47 transactions. 3 years of dinners, of trips, of holding the architecture of his career together so carefully that no one saw my hands in it, and somewhere inside that same timeline, he had been doing this. I stood at that window for a long time. When I came home that evening, Garrett was at the kitchen table. He had made eggs. He always made eggs on Tuesdays, and a financial newspaper was folded open beside his plate. He didn't look up when I came in. I set my bag on the counter, poured water, sat down across from him. "Sleep okay?" he asked, still reading. "Like a child," I said. He turned a page. I picked up my fork. "Before I tell you what I found on that laptop, the 14 pages that changed everything I need to know, you are still here with me. If you have made it this far, drop the number 8 in the comments. Just that. No explanation needed. I will know what it means. Because what I am about to share is the moment this story stopped being about a marriage and started being about something else entirely. A gentle note. The story continuing from here carries fictional elements shaped for reflection and depth. If this kind of narrative is not for you, this is a natural place to stop, and there is no judgment in that. But if you are staying, keep watching. The next part matters. There are moments that rewrite everything that came before them. Not because the facts change, the facts were always there, but because suddenly you can see them all at once clearly. The way you see an entire city when you finally reach the top of a hill you've been climbing for years. March 14th. 2022 was my hill. Garrett had left that morning for a 2-day client meeting in Atlanta. He kissed me on the cheek before he left, a reflexive thing. The kind of gesture that had stopped meaning much somewhere around the middle of year 2, but had continued out of habit, and the way people keep picture frames on walls long after they've stopped noticing the photographs. I had a full day scheduled. Meetings, a call with the Memphis subsidiary, a review of a property contract that had been sitting in my queue for 3 weeks. By 9 o'clock that evening, I had finished everything except the insurance documentation I needed for the homeowner's policy renewal. We kept the household files on the shared laptop in the kitchen, an older machine, the kind of practical, unassuming object that had never seemed worth securing. Garrett used it for personal browsing and travel bookings. I used it occasionally for household logistics when my work devices were charging in the study. It had never occurred to me that it might matter which machine I used for what. I opened it at the kitchen table under the overhead light with a glass of water beside me that I didn't touch for the next 2 hours. The insurance folder was in the same general directory it had always been. I navigated there quickly, clicked, and missed. My cursor landed one folder to the right. The label read, "Personal Do Not Open." I looked at it for a moment. I had known that folder existed. It had been there for at least a year. I had never asked about it because I had believed with the particular sincerity of someone who wants to believe it, that everyone was entitled to private space, that a marriage built on trust didn't require me to audit a folder called personal. I had told myself that more than once. I had believed it genuinely. I double-clicked. There were 11 items inside. 10 of them were the kinds of things you'd expect: scanned receipts, travel itineraries, a folder of contacts. The 11th was a document. The file name was Dissolution Plan GD. It had been modified 11 days ago, 14 pages. I opened it. I want to be precise about what I read, because precision is the only way I know how to tell this part of the story without falling into the version of it that becomes about rage. This was not a rage story. Not that night. The document was formatted cleanly: headers, subheadings, numbered sections. It looked like a business proposal. In some ways, it was. It outlined in careful, methodical language a 5-year plan. Year 1 through Year 3, establish joint financial history, maintain marital structure, identify and document all shared assets. Year 4, begin separation of personal holdings. Consult legal resources, draft post-nuptial agreement. Year 5, 2024, initiate proceedings. Minimize spousal claim. Structure complete. There were sections I read twice. There was a section on asset classification, which properties would be categorized as his, which would be designated as acquired during the marriage, which would be difficult to contest. There was a section on my income. My salary from the property management role I had maintained as a cover identity was listed accurately and described as modest. There was a line near the bottom of the section that read, "Spouse's independent financial capacity limited. Dependency established." I turned to page 9. There, inside a paragraph about third-party accounts and fund structuring, was a name I had seen once before in pencil on Agatha's third page of cross-reference transfer records. Drummond L. This time there was context. Enough context that I understood what I was reading. Enough context that I understood what Drummond L. was not a business associate. Not a coincidental name in a financial column. Enough context that the January morning in my office, the folder Agatha had opened on my desk, the 47 transfers, the Delaware Shell Company, all of it suddenly rearranged itself into a shape I could see whole. Page 12, the last entry in the timeline section. Year 5, 2024, initiate proceedings. Spousal claim minimum. Structure complete. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a long time. Not crying, not planning, just sitting there with the full weight of it. Not the betrayal, not the money, not the 5-year plan, written in clean font like a business proposal. Just the simple, stupid bare fact that I had walked into that gala on a Thursday evening and thought I was lucky. I had wanted it to be real. Even then, sitting in the dark with 14 pages of evidence that it wasn't some small, stubborn, foolish part of me, was grieving the man I had thought I married. I allowed myself to sit with that for 10 minutes. I thought about the Thursday evening at Vanderbilt. I thought about the way he had said, "You're the only person I'm talking to who isn't performing." I thought about the way I had felt not flattered, exactly, but seen. I had spent years keeping my identity invisible, and in 20 minutes of conversation I had wanted badly to let someone see it. How easy it must have been. How careful he must have been not to appear as though he was trying. I thought about the wedding, about Edmund's hand on my arm, firm and brief, and the way he had not said a single critical word about Garrett all day, because he knew me well enough to know that criticism wasn't what would reach me. I thought about Agatha standing at the back of the garden watching. "I will watch over him every day," she had said the next morning. She had. I thought about the past 2.5 years, about the client introductions I had arranged through the Hartwell network without attaching my name to a single one, about the quarterly projections I had quietly corrected, about the award ceremony where Garrett had spoken for 4 minutes and 37 seconds and never looked at the chair where I was sitting. I had told myself that was fine. I had told myself I didn't need acknowledgement, that the satisfaction was in the architecture, not the credit. I thought about how carefully I had constructed the story I wanted to believe. There is a difference between wanting something to have been different and letting it destroy you. I have always known which side of that line I stand on. I stood up, walked to the bathroom sink, and ran cold water over my face for about 30 seconds. I looked at myself in the mirror, the way you look at something you're assessing rather than recognizing. Then I dried my face, walked back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. By the time Garrett's key turned in the front door at 11 o'clock that night, there were 2 cups of tea on the table still steaming. He smelled of something I didn't recognize, a perfume that wasn't mine, faint enough to be deniable, present enough to be deliberate. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me. "You're still up," he said. "I made tea," I said. "Sit down." He sat. He set his travel bag on the floor beside his chair. He loosened his jacket. And then he began talking about the Atlanta meetings, about traffic on the ER-24 interchange, about a restaurant near his hotel that had terrible service and an inexplicably long wait. He talked the way people talk when they are comfortable, when they believe they are inside a space that is safe. We talked for 25 minutes. He did not know, he could not have known, that those 25 minutes were the last ones in which he had any advantage. He did not know that while I asked about the restaurant and nodded at the traffic story and refilled his tea without being asked, I had already made the most important decision of my life. Not to confront him, not to explode, not to do anything that would give him the opportunity to see what was coming. Something quieter than that. And something that would last considerably longer. Rosalind Crane picks up on the second ring. Always the second. I had verified this across time zones, across crises. Across one particularly bad Tuesday in Denver when I called from an airport bathroom floor. Second ring. Every time. When you have someone like that in your life, you don't take it for granted. You call when it truly matters. April of 2022 was when it mattered most. Her office is on the 14th floor of a building on Commerce Street in the part of downtown Nashville that still feels like it's conducting serious business rather than performing it. No exposed brick, no industrial lighting, no carefully curated coffee bar in the lobby. Dark wood, clean lines, a window that looks directly out onto the street below. I had been in that office maybe a dozen times over the years for various Hartwell Group matters, lease negotiations, a contract dispute in 2017, a brief conversation about estate planning that Edmund had asked me to handle quietly. Rosalind had never asked me why I kept certain things off the main Hartwell legal team. She understood instinctively that some matters required separation. I arrived at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning in early April. She was already at her desk. She did not stand when I came in, which I appreciated. She gestured to the chair across from her and waited. I sat down. I set my bag on the floor. I looked at the window for exactly 1 second, then looked at her. And I told her everything. I want to be clear about what everything meant in this context, because I am precise about language. I told her about the Thursday evening at the Vanderbilt Alumni Gala in the spring of 2018. I told her about 14 months of a relationship that had felt genuine and the specific, documented ways I had helped build Garrett Daly's career during that period and the 2.5 years that followed. I told her about the January morning in my office, the 47 transfers, the Delaware Shell Company, the name on the third page that I had not recognized at the time. I told her about the night of March 14th, the shared laptop, the folder, the 14 pages. I told her about page 12, line 4, and the phrase structure complete. I told her all of this in the same tone I would use to present a quarterly earnings summary. Not because I wasn't feeling it, I was, but because I have learned, over many years of running an organization that cannot afford visible instability, that emotional precision is a form of power. You can feel everything and still choose how it leaves your body. Rosalind listened without interrupting. Not once. She sat with her hands folded on the desk, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, where she had placed them when I first came in. And she listened with the particular quality of attention that is rare enough that when you encounter it, you notice it. Not waiting for you to finish. Actually listening. When I stopped talking, the office was quiet. Traffic sound from Commerce Street filtered through the glass, distant and unhurried. Rosalind sat still for 30 seconds. I counted. Then she asked one question. "What do you want?" I reached into the outer pocket of my bag and removed a folded piece of paper. Folded twice quarters, precise creases. I had written it the morning after the night of the 14th. Sitting at the kitchen table before Garrett came downstairs while the coffee was still brewing. I slid it across the desk. Rosalind unfolded it slowly. She read. Her eyebrows moved, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, line by line, the way a person reacts when the words in front of them are requiring continuous recalibration. She reached the bottom of the page. She looked up. She did not say, "This is ambitious." She did not say, "Are you sure?" She did not perform concern or surprise. She set the paper flat on her desk, pressed one hand briefly over it as though steadying it, and said, "This will take time." He gave me a 5-year timeline. I said, "We have time to be thorough." She looked at me for a long moment. Not sizing me up, she had known me long enough for that to be unnecessary. Something else. The look of a person deciding whether the situation in front of them is the kind they want to be involved in. "Then we'll build something," she said, "that he will never see coming." Crestview Meridian, LLC, was registered in the state of Delaware on April 28, 2022. The name had taken me 4 days to land on. I had written down 11 options and eliminated them one by one. Too distinctive, too obviously linked, too memorable. Crestview Meridian had exactly the right quality of forgettable, the kind of name that appears in financial filings and produces nothing when you search it casually. The kind that sits in a column of LLC registrations without pulling the I. Ordinary name, extraordinary purpose. Rosalind handled the filing through a secondary counsel, a colleague she trusted with structural work. Someone who would not have reason to connect the entity to the Hartwell Group or to me by name. She explained the architecture over 2 meetings in that first April. Not confrontation, not litigation, not yet, not directly, but a structural repositioning, quiet acquisition. Patient documentation. Building in Rosalind's words. A factual record so complete that when the time comes, there is nothing left to argue about. She did not tell me that everything would be fine. Rosalind Crane is not that kind of woman. What she said was, "We'll need to be meticulous, patient, and extremely quiet about this." 3 things, as it happened, that I was exceptionally good at. I had spent 12 years running a $2.3 billion organization without putting my name on a single press release. I understood quiet. I understood patient. I understood the particular discipline of building something significant in plain sight while giving no one a reason to look. What I had not had before, that April was someone who understood it with me. I left her office at 12:47. I took the elevator down, walked through the lobby, and sat in my car on the parking level for 3 minutes before starting the engine. Not because I was overwhelmed, I was not overwhelmed. I had been overwhelmed on the night of March 14th for approximately 10 minutes before I stood up and washed my face. This was different. This was the particular stillness of a person who has just made an irreversible decision and is taking one moment to register that fact before moving forward. Then I started the car and drove north on 8th Avenue. Somewhere around the bridge, my regular phone buzzed on the console. I glanced at the screen at a red light. Garrett. I picked up. Hey. His voice was easy, unhurried. The voice of a man who has had a good morning and expects a good afternoon. You want me to grab dinner on the way home? I'm passing by that Thai place you like on 12th. Sure, I said. Whatever you want. You okay? You sound quiet. Long day, I said. I'm fine. Okay, see you in an hour. I ended the call, set the phone back on the console, looked at the Nashville skyline through the windshield, the late afternoon light coming in flat and golden over the Cumberland, the buildings reflecting it in long, broken columns across the water. It has started, I thought, and he has no idea. I turned onto the highway and drove home. We are at the halfway point of this story, and what happens next is the moment I stopped being reactive and started being deliberate. Before I continue, leave the word ready in the comments if you are still with me. I read every single one, and right now I genuinely want to know how many of you have stayed this far. What I am about to tell you involves a document, a signature, and a decision that looked like surrender to everyone watching, and was anything but. One note before we continue: elements of this story have been shaped with fictional details for narrative clarity and educational value. If that changes how you want to engage, completely understood. But if you are still here, good. The best part is just beginning. He presented it like a peace offering. That's what I remember most clearly, the particular energy of a man who believes he has just protected himself from something. He set it on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning in May, with the carefully practiced casualness of someone who had rehearsed the gesture more than once. I recognized it immediately. I had seen that gesture in boardrooms my entire adult life. It means I already know how this ends. The document was 16 pages spiral-bound, printed on paper slightly heavier than standard. His attorney had done competent work. The language was clean, the clauses specific. The definition section at the front thorough, enough to suggest someone had spent real billable hours on it. Garrett set it down and said with exactly the right amount of offhandedness, "I've been talking to my lawyer about some financial planning. Just something to have in place. Nothing dramatic." "Of course," I said. "I'll read it." He looked at me for a moment. I think he expected more, some version of hesitation or questions, or the particular female discomfort that certain men anticipate when paperwork appears unexpectedly. What he got was me picking up the document, pouring a second cup of coffee, and sitting down at the kitchen table. I read all 16 pages. The structure was straightforward. Assets acquired prior to the marriage remained separately held. Assets acquired during the marriage would be evaluated at time of dissolution based on documented contribution, and any claims against business entities would require proof of direct financial involvement. Standard language for a post-nuptial agreement drafted by someone whose primary concern is protecting their client's existing portfolio. Page 4 covered Daly and Reed Capital. Garrett held a 66% controlling stake, which the document classified as premarital property. Correct. It was. The firm had existed before our marriage, even if it had been a considerably smaller and less profitable version of itself at that point. I noted the clause and moved on. Pages 6 through 8 addressed real estate. The Bellmead house, purchased jointly 18 months into our marriage, was listed with a formula for calculating each party's proportional contribution to the mortgage. I did the arithmetic quickly. Under the formula, my contribution was understated by a factor of roughly 2, based on how the down payment had been structured. I noted that as well and kept reading. Page 11 was where I almost smiled. The section heading read, Spouse's Independent Financial Holdings. Below it, the language was careful and precise. The financial holdings of the non-initiating spouse have not been independently verified and are presumed minimal pending disclosure at time of proceedings. Minimal. I read the word twice. Then I set the page flat on the table, picked up my coffee cup, and took a sip. Minimal. I had built a $2.3 billion organization across 15 companies and 4 states, and the word Garrett Daly's attorney had chosen for my financial standing was minimal. I almost smiled at that. Almost. I finished the document, picked up the pen Garrett had left on the counter deliberately, I was certain within easy reach, turned to page 16, signed my name in the space provided. The pen did not hesitate. Garrett exhaled. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic man, which had always been one of his better qualities, but the exhale was real, and it was audible, and it lasted just a beat longer than a person exhales when nothing is at stake. He took the document, placed it back in its folder with the same careful efficiency he had used to set it down, and said something about picking up dry cleaning before the weekend. "Sure," I said. He left for the office 20 minutes later. I sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes, finishing my coffee, listening to the sound of the house after he was gone. Then I picked up my phone and sent a single message to a number saved under a name that would mean nothing to anyone scrolling through my contacts. Phase 2. Proceed as planned. The next 8 months moved the way careful, deliberate work always moves, which is to say mostly invisibly marked by small confirmations and quiet increments, rather than visible events. Rosalind managed the architecture. I reviewed and approved each stage. What I can tell you without going into the kind of detail that belongs in a legal deposition rather than a personal account is this. Between May and December of 2022, Crestview Meridian LLC acquired a 34% stake in Daly and Reed Capital. It happened in 4 tranches each, structured to fall below the thresholds that would require disclosure under standard private equity reporting conventions. The first acquisition in late May came through a secondary holding entity managed by Marcus Okafor, an investor I had worked with twice before through the Hartwell Network, a man who understood that certain transactions required discretion and who asked exactly the right number of questions, which is to say none about ultimate beneficial ownership. The subsequent tranches followed in August-October, and the last week of November, each passing through 1 or 2 additional layers of structure before reaching Crestview. Garrett Daly had built his company to a 340% growth rate over 30 months. He had accepted the introductions, executed the strategies, taken the awards, and believed. With the full sincerity of a man who has never had reason to doubt his own competence, that he had done this himself. He had no idea that the entity now holding a third of his company had been formed in April in Delaware by the woman who had signed his post-nuptial agreement without hesitation 6 months earlier. On the evening of December 19th, I was in the office at the Gulch when my phone rang. Rosalind. 7 o'clock, almost exactly. Crestview Meridian holds 34% of Daly and Reed Capital as of market close today, she said. I looked at the confirmation document on the screen in front of me. The numbers were precise and clean, the way Rosalind always delivered things. "Does he know Crestview exists?" I asked. "He has never heard the name," she said. I looked at the screen for another moment. "Then we're ready for the next phase," I said. "We are," she said. "Get some rest." She ended the call. I sat in the office for a few minutes after looking at the Nashville skyline through the window, the same view I had stood at in January. When Agatha had placed 47 pages in front of me and asked me to understand what I was looking at, the city looked the same. The light was the same. I was not the same. I closed the laptop, put on my coat, and drove home. Garrett had cooked dinner. He did that sometimes. When he was in a good mood and the week had gone well, a habit from early in our marriage that had become infrequent enough to feel deliberate when it happened. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and something with butter. Candles on the table, low and steady. A bottle of wine open on the counter, 2 glasses already poured. He was still in his work clothes jacket, off sleeves rolled. He looked in the candlelight and the warmth of the kitchen like the version of himself I had met at a gala 4 years ago, and decided, against better judgment, to trust. "Good day," he asked without turning from the stove. "Productive," I said. I set my bag down and washed my hands at the sink. He plated the food, chicken, roasted vegetables, the careful presentation of a man who likes to do things properly. We sat down across from each other. He lifted his glass. "To a good year," he said. "To a good year," I said. I drank. I smiled. The wine was excellent. He had good taste in wine. I had always given him that. And I sat across from a man who had just raised a glass to the woman currently holding 34% of his company. He didn't know. The candlelight moved between us, steady and warm. Outside, Nashville was finishing its December Tuesday in the ordinary way of cities that don't know what is happening inside their buildings. He picked up his fork. So did I. I hired Sterling Holt because Rosalind had recommended him, and because when I met him at a coffee shop on Charlotte Avenue on a Wednesday morning, he ordered black coffee, asked me 4 questions, and said nothing further until I had finished speaking. In my experience, the people who talk least in a first meeting understand the most by the end of it. He was 44, ex-military, in the way that certain men carry it without announcing it, in how he sat, in how he assessed a room before sitting down, in how he folded his hands on the table and waited without fidgeting. He wore a gray jacket and no tie. His eyes were the kind that didn't move much when he was thinking, which I found useful. When people's eyes move a lot, they're processing. When they're still, they've already processed and are deciding what to do about it. I told him what I needed. He asked his 4 questions, 1 about timeline, 1 about the target's professional structure, 1 about what I already had, and 1 I won't repeat here because it was the kind of question that only matters to the person doing the work. Then he picked up his coffee, said he would be in touch, and left. The entire meeting lasted 19 minutes. I heard from him 3 weeks later. He came to my office at the Gulch on a Thursday morning in early January. He sat down, opened a folder, and began. The woman's name was Lacey Drummond. She was 29 years old. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Germantown, a neighborhood north of downtown Nashville that had become, in recent years, the kind of place where young professionals moved when they wanted something with character, but couldn't yet afford the older zip codes. She worked in marketing at a mid-sized firm on 2nd Avenue. She had been with the same company for 3 years, and had, by all accounts, Sterling had gathered a reputation for being competent, reliable, and private. Garrett Daly had been seeing her for 14 months. I let that number settle for a moment before I spoke. 14 months. Beginning in early 2022, which placed the start of the relationship within weeks of Agatha's January discovery of the 47 transfers. I did not say that out loud. I noted it and moved forward. "Does she know he's married?" I asked. Sterling looked at me steadily. "No," he said. He told her he was divorced. Said his ex-wife had nearly destroyed his company before he got out. The office was quiet for a few seconds. I looked at the folder on the desk between us. I looked at Sterling. He had delivered that sentence the way a surgeon describes a procedure accurately without performance, giving the information its full weight without embellishment. I appreciated that more than I can explain. "What did she provide?" I asked. He walked me through it methodically. Lacey Drummond had cooperated fully and voluntarily. Not, Sterling was careful to note, because she had any particular agenda toward Garrett, but because when she learned the full shape of the situation, she felt she had been deceived in a way she was not willing to stay silent about. The distinction mattered. A witness acting from fury is a liability. A witness acting from conviction is an asset. What she provided, a series of text messages spanning 14 months, screenshots of communication that included specific references to financial planning. 3 wire transfer records from accounts she had not known were client funds, and a set of photographs that established a documented pattern of contact spanning multiple cities: Nashville, Atlanta, Memphis, one weekend in Asheville that Garrett had told me was a client meeting. I did not react to the Asheville detail. I was past the point where individual details required visible reaction. What I was doing as Sterling spoke was noting the legal weight of each item, the way Rosalind had taught me to think about documentation, not emotionally, but architecturally. What could be submitted? What would hold? What would be corroborated by other records? She's willing to testify, I asked. She's willing to make a formal statement, Sterling said. She's not looking for a confrontation. She wants the truth on record. I nodded. He closed the folder. I thought the meeting was finished. He didn't stand up. She asked me something before I left, he said. I waited. She asked if your wife knew that he'd been telling people she was the problem. The window behind Sterling showed the same Nashville morning. It always showed the Gulch's industrial architecture softened by winter light. The kind of gray-blue sky that sits over Tennessee in January like something thinking about what it wants to do. I looked at it for a moment. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her that his wife was the reason we were having the conversation. I looked back at Sterling. Good, I said. That's accurate. He stood up then, picked up his jacket, prepared to leave in the same unhurried, efficient way he had arrived. I was about to thank him when he stopped at the door. He didn't turn all the way around, just paused with the particular quality of a person who has remembered something they had almost decided not to say. One more thing, he said. She mentioned that he kept records, detailed ones. She saw him writing in what she described as a journal digital encrypted. She said he'd had it since before she met him. He paused. Since before you married him. The room was quiet. I looked at the desk, at the empty space where Sterling's folder had been, at my own hands which were as they had been for the past year, completely still. Find it, I said. He left. I sat in the office for a long time after the door closed, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a man who had kept a detailed encrypted, password-protected record of his own activities and what that record might contain, and thinking about the fact that he had begun it before our wedding, before the postnuptial agreement, before Daly and Reed's award season, before he had any reason to believe he needed it, which meant he had always believed he would need it, which meant that everything from the Thursday evening at Vanderbilt, from the first conversation by the jazz quartet, from "you're the only person I'm talking to who isn't performing," had been part of a structure that predated me. I sat with that for a while. Then I straightened the papers on my desk, picked up my phone, and called Rosalind. Norbert Finch ironed his dress shirts every Sunday evening. He had done this for 22 years, his daughter told me later. He apologized when people bumped into him. He had a goldfish named Gerald. Norbert Finch was not the kind of man who would help move $4.7 million through offshore accounts. That was precisely why. When I sat across from him at a corner table at Frothy Monkey on a gray February morning, the first thing I said was, "I know you didn't do this voluntarily." He had arrived 4 minutes early. I know because I was already there, in the corner seat with my back to the wall, a habit I had developed over years of meetings where the terms were not yet established, and I watched him come through the door. He was 55, slightly built, wearing a navy blazer that was a size too large in the shoulders. He scanned the room the way people scan a room when they are expecting something bad and have decided to meet it standing up anyway. When he saw me, something in his face moved. Not relief, not fear, something in between, the expression of a person who has been waiting a long time for a particular conversation and still isn't certain whether they want to have it. He sat down. A server came. He ordered coffee and did not pick it up for the next 20 minutes. I placed 3 pages on the table between us, printed on plain white paper, no letterhead, no identifying marks. I had assembled them carefully over the past 3 weeks, working backward from the transfer records Agatha had first identified in January 2022, and cross-referencing them against a secondary set of documents that Sterling had quietly obtained through public filing records and a contact inside a Delaware compliance office. Norbert looked at the pages. He didn't touch them. "You've seen these before," I said. It was not a question. He nodded once. "Then you know what they show," I said. He nodded again. I waited. He spoke for about 20 minutes. His voice had the quality of someone who has rehearsed the words many times in private, not because he was prepared to give them, but because the weight of carrying them had worn grooves in his thinking. And the sentences came out shaped by that repetition, rather than by any intention to be articulate. He looked at the table while he spoke. He looked at his untouched coffee. He looked at his own hands. What he told me. In the spring of 2020, Garrett had come to him with something. A piece of information about Norbert's personal life, something that had happened 15 years earlier. Before Norbert had joined Daly and Reed, before his daughter was born, before he had built the quiet, orderly life he was now working very hard to protect. The specifics don't belong in this account. What matters is that Garrett had found it, had documented it, and had made clear in terms that were never written down and never needed to be what the alternative to cooperation looked like. Norbert had opened the shell company in Delaware in March 2020. He had processed the wire transfers, all 47 of them, over 14 months using routing instructions that Garrett provided directly. Every transfer order carried Garrett's signature in the authorization field. Norbert's name appeared on the account establishment documents and nowhere else. He had structured the transactions the way Garrett specified, at the amounts Garrett specified, on the schedule Garrett specified. He told me no one would believe me, Norbert said, finally looking up. His voice had gone very flat. He said I was just as guilty as he was. I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. He was wrong about both of those things, I said, and I have everything I need to prove it. Norbert looked at me for a long time. Not with suspicion, there was something past suspicion in his expression, something that comes from having been inside a bad situation long enough that you stop evaluating whether rescue is real and start evaluating whether you deserve it. Why are you doing this? He asked. Protecting me, I mean. I thought about that question honestly before I answered it. I could have given him the strategic version that a coerced witness who feels protected testifies better than a frightened one, that his cooperation was a material asset in what was coming, that his value to what Rosalind and I had built over the past year was concrete and specific. All of that was true, but it wasn't the complete answer, because there's a difference, I said, between a person who does something wrong and a person who is backed into a corner until doing something wrong is the only exit they can find. You're the second kind, and the second kind deserves a way out. Norbert didn't say anything. He looked at the table. His jaw moved slightly the way a person's jaw moves when they are working to keep their face composed, and the effort is considerable. His eyes went red at the edges, not crying but close to it in the way that matters more than crying. The way that happens when something has been held for so long that the first sign of release is almost physical. I looked away to give him a moment that was his. When I looked back, he reached into the breast pocket of his too large blazer and placed a USB drive on the table without a word. It was small, the kind you can hold between two fingers, the kind that looks like nothing. He slid it across the table with 2 fingers and then pulled his hand back and finally picked up his coffee. He didn't look at me when he did it. He didn't need to. I drove back to the gulch in the kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that has weight and texture that presses slightly against the inside of the car. The USB drive was in the outer pocket of my bag, which was on the passenger seat, which I was aware of the way you're aware of something significant that has been placed in your care. I called Rosalind at 9:47. We have the full paper trail, I said. Every transaction, every account number, his signature on every authorization order. There was a pause on her end. Not a long one. Rosalind didn't do long pauses, but a pause with quality to it. The kind that communicates that the person on the other end has just updated a very complex internal calculation. Then we're ready to move, she said. I'll call you tonight about next steps. I ended the call. Outside the car window, Nashville in February was doing what Nashville in February always does, gray sky pressing down over the Cumberland. The streets running with the particular purposeful efficiency of a city that doesn't stop for weather. People walked to work. Traffic moved. The city had no idea. I looked at the bag on the passenger seat. I had spent the past 11 months being meticulous, patient, and extremely quiet. I had signed a document that called me minimal. I had sat across dinner tables and raised glasses and asked about restaurants and listened to speeches that didn't mention my name. I had waited and planned and built something in silence that the man I had married had no vocabulary for. And now, on a gray Tuesday morning in February, it was ready. Inside, something that had been very still for a very long time was beginning to move. My father never once said "I told you so" to me. Not once in 38 years. Not when I dropped the piano lessons he had paid for. Not when I hired the wrong person in 2016. Not when I walked down the aisle toward a man he had driven home in silence after their first dinner. What he said instead, when I finally sat in his study in March and told him everything, was, "I've been waiting for you to come home, Celeste." And somehow that was so much worse, and also so much better. I drove to Belle Meade on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of March. Not the house I had shared with Garrett, the other one, the original one. The one with the magnolia tree in the front yard that my grandfather had planted in 1962, and that had survived every Nashville ice storm since. The one where I had grown up learning that wealth was not something you announced, but something you maintained quietly with the same diligence you applied to everything else that mattered. My mother opened the door before I reached the porch. She didn't ask any questions. She pulled me into the kind of embrace that mothers who have been waiting not impatiently, but attentively for a long time give their children when the children finally arrive. Both arms, no hesitation longer than usual. She smelled like the same hand lotion she had used my entire life, and for a moment I was 8 years old and the world had not yet required anything complicated from me. "Come inside," she said when she released me. Nothing else. I followed her in. The four of us sat in the living room, Edmund in the chair he always occupied, the wingback near the fireplace that had been his for as long as I could remember. Elspeth on the sofa beside me, Bennett in the chair across, still in his work clothes, jacket still on. The way Bennett always was when he came directly from the office without stopping to change, because stopping felt like losing time. He had arrived 20 minutes before me. My mother had called him that morning without telling me she was going to, in the way that families who function well anticipate what is needed before it is asked for. I told them everything. I started with the Thursday evening at Vanderbilt Spring 2018, the jazz quartet. The man by the band who had said, "You're the only person I'm talking to who isn't performing." I told them about 14 months of a relationship I had believed in genuinely. I told them about the wedding and the years after it, and what I had built on Garrett's behalf, and how I had built it. I told them about January 2022, Agatha's folder, 47 transfers the name on the third page. I told them about the night of March 14th, the laptop, the dissolution plan, the phrase spouses claim, minimal. I told them about Rosalind, about Crestview Meridian, about 8 months of quiet acquisition, and a 34% stake in a company whose owner had signed a post-nuptial agreement, believing he had protected himself from a woman with nothing. I told them about Sterling, about Lacey Drummond, about a USB drive the size of a thumb placed on a coffee shop table by a man who had been living under threat for 3 years. I spoke for almost 40 minutes. Edmund said nothing. Elspeth made no sound, but at some point I became aware without looking directly at her that she was crying the way she had always cried, quietly without calling attention to it, as though tears were a private matter that happened to occur in shared spaces. Bennett sat completely still. His right hand resting on the arm of the chair was closed into a fist. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, the living room was quiet except for the sound of the magnolia branches outside moving against the window glass. Edmund stood up without saying anything and walked out of the room. His study was down the hallway, a room I had been in thousands of times, a room that smelled permanently of old paper and the particular dark roasted coffee he had been ordering from the same Tennessee supplier since before I was born. I heard the sound of a drawer opening, then a filing cabinet, then footsteps returning. He came back carrying a folder. Dark green, the kind of hanging folder from a physical filing system, the edges soft with age. He placed it on the coffee table in front of me and sat back down. I looked at it, then at him. 2015, he said. I opened the folder. The documents inside were 8 years old, some of them. Printed on paper that had gone slightly warm with age, the text perfectly legible, the details precise. A business dispute small by any metric that matters in the Hartwell world, significant in what it revealed about the man involved. A partnership arrangement in a mid-sized real estate venture in Memphis. A junior partner who had signed over development rights based on representations that turned out to be incorrect. Not a lawsuit, it had been handled through private mediation, the way things get handled when both parties prefer the absence of public record. The junior partner had received a settlement. Garrett Daly's name appeared in the originating complaint and in 2 of the mediation transcripts. The complaint used the word misrepresentation. The mediator's notes used the phrase pattern of omission. I read it twice. I tried to tell you, Edmund said. His voice was level, but with an effort I recognized, the same effort I had been making for the past year, the effort of a person choosing to deliver information accurately rather than emotionally. But you were in love. There is nothing a father can say to a daughter who has decided to love someone that she hasn't first decided to hear. He paused. I should have found another way to say it. That's mine to carry. I looked at my father, 68 years old, a man who had built a company from borrowed money and a discipline I had spent my adult life trying to match. A man who wore his emotions the way certain people wear their best clothes, only when the occasion genuinely required it, and with extreme care. His eyes were red at the edges. I got up from the sofa. I knelt on the floor in front of his chair the way I used to when I was 7 years old and had done something I was sorry for and didn't yet have the words to say it adequately. I rested my head on his knee. He placed his hand on my hair. We didn't speak for a while. We didn't need to. Behind me, I heard Bennett stand up. He crossed the room and placed his hand on my shoulder. Not gently the way people touch someone who is fragile, but firmly. The way you place a hand on someone you are standing with. My mother made a small sound from the sofa, the kind of sound that isn't quite a word, but contains everything that matters. I kept my eyes closed and stayed exactly where I was for another minute, letting my family hold the weight of it with me, something I had not allowed myself for the past year. Then I sat up. Bennett was the one who spoke first, which was exactly right. He had always been the one who knew when the moment for sitting with something had passed, and the moment for doing something about it had arrived. So, he said, what do we do with all of this? I stood up. I smoothed my jacket. I was aware as I did it that I was putting something back on. Not a mask exactly, but a register. The one I used when a situation required thinking rather than feeling, when the next decision mattered more than the last emotion. We give Dad's file to Rosalind, I said. And then we finish this. Edmund looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the green folder on the coffee table and back at me. And there was something in his face that I had seen only a handful of times in my life, a particular quality of pride that he was careful never to make theatrical. But that was unmistakable when it appeared. He nodded once. Finish it properly, he said. Garrett's post-nuptial agreement was 16 pages. Rosalind's response was 89. She placed it on my desk on the morning of April 3, 2023. The way you set down something that can change the temperature of a room simply by existing in it. Read it slowly, she said. Read all of it. I did. It took me 40 minutes. When I finished, I looked up at her. Send it, I said. The document was bound with a single black clip, the pages slightly warm from the printer. I turned the first page and read the way Rosalind had taught me to read legal documents, not for the drama of the language, but for the architecture of it, for the load-bearing walls and the structural points and the places where the argument was built to absorb pressure. What I found across 89 pages was a structure I recognized the way you recognize something you have watched being built from the foundation up. Section 1. A full valuation of Hartwell Group. 15 subsidiaries, 4 states' assets documented as of the most recent fiscal year. $2.3 billion. Every entity listed by name, formation date, and ownership percentage. Every year of growth since I assumed leadership in 2014, documented with reference to audited financials. The section was 22 pages long, And it was the kind of 22 pages that does not announce itself loudly. It simply exists the way a mountain exists, requiring no commentary about its size. Section 2, Crestview Meridian LLC, Formation Date, April 28, 2022. Delaware Registration, a 34% minority stake in Daly and Reed Capital, acquired in 4 tranches between May and December of the same year. Each acquisition is documented with transfer records, beneficial ownership filings, and a legal opinion confirming the validity of the holding structure. The section was 14 pages. It included a sentence I had asked Rosalind to place there specifically, at time of acquisition. The entity being acquired was valued at approximately 47 times its pre-2019 market value, a growth attributable in substantial part to strategic introductions and operational support provided by the beneficial owner of Crestview Meridian. She had placed it on page 31, third paragraph without fanfare. The encrypted journal Sterling had spent 2 months tracing turned out to be unnecessary. By the time Norbert placed the USB drive on the table at Frothy Monkey, we had everything we needed. The journal became irrelevant before we ever found it. Section 3 was the one that had taken the longest to build. Every movement of money documented dated cross-referenced against 3 separate sets of records: the routing architecture, the shell structure, the account trail. And running through all of it, consistent across every single authorization form, the same signature, not once forged, not once missing, present and deliberate, 47 times. The section was 19 pages, and it was the section I had read most slowly. Not because it was complicated, it was not complicated, but because it represented the work of 3 people who had carried it carefully: Agatha, who had found it first; Norbert, who had documented it under duress for 3 years and placed a USB drive on a table in a coffee shop without a word; and Rosalind, who had built it into something admissible. Norbert had been granted full cooperation immunity by the time the dossier reached the relevant authorities. He had not acted freely. The record made that clear. Section 4, the supporting testimony. Lacey Drummond's written statement notarized voluntary. Sterling Holt's investigative report certified. A chronology that cross-referenced the financial transfers against a pattern of personal conduct that spanned in total nearly 5 years. Section 5, the historical precedent. A 2015 business dispute from Memphis. Mediation transcripts. The phrases misrepresentation and pattern of omission. 8 pages, filed in a green folder in a study in Belle Mead for 8 years by a man who never said "I told you so," who had simply kept the evidence patiently, the way he kept everything that might one day matter. I turned the last page and looked up at Rosalind. "Send it," I said. She sent it at 11:14 that morning to Garrett's attorney of record, and to the relevant oversight bodies whose involvement in cases of documented financial misconduct of this scale is not discretionary, but mandatory. I was not present for either transmission. I was in my office at the Gulch working through a Memphis subsidiary review when Rosalind texted at 11:17 delivered. I read the word, set the phone down, picked up my pen, kept working. The call from Garrett's attorney came at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Rosalind told me about it in her office at 4:30, sitting with her hands folded on her desk in the way she always sat when delivering information she wanted me to receive accurately rather than emotionally. She recounted the conversation in the same precise, unhurried manner she brought to everything. Garrett's attorney had called, using the measured tone of someone who has spent decades managing crises on behalf of people who create them a voice that is professionally smooth, trained to reveal nothing. What the voice revealed despite itself was a person recalibrating rapidly. There was a pause before his first sentence that lasted approximately 3 seconds longer than professional composure requires. "Ms. Crane," he had said, "the asset holdings of your client appear to be considerably more substantial than previously indicated." Rosalind had said, "Yes, that's accurate." A silence that lasted long enough to have weight. "Mr. Daly will need time to review the documentation," Oh, of course, Rosalind had said. Take whatever time is needed. The numbers will still be there. She had ended the call shortly after. I listened to this without changing my expression. Not because I felt nothing, I felt a great deal in the contained, pressurized way of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and is only now setting it down. But I had made a decision sometime around the second month of this process that I was not going to find satisfaction in Garrett's discomfort. Not because he didn't deserve it. He did. But because satisfaction in someone else's distress is a smaller thing than what I had been working toward. And I had spent too long building something significant to reduce it at the end to something petty. I nodded at Rosalind. Thank you, I said. She nodded back. He had walked into our marriage with a 16-page document designed to protect himself from a woman he had assessed as having minimal independent means. He had signed an award acceptance speech, 4 minutes and 37 seconds long, that didn't include my name. He had maintained a 5-year plan with its own timeline and terminology filed under a folder called Personal Do Not Open, because he had never considered it necessary to open. I had brought 89 pages built on 4 years of patience, 3 layers of corporate structure, the courage of an accountant, the honesty of a woman he had deceived, and a file that my father had kept in his study for 8 years waiting for exactly this moment. He had brought a knife. I had rebuilt the entire kitchen. I left the office just before 6. The evening air had the particular quality of Nashville in early April, the temperature finally having decided, after months of deliberation, to commit to warmth. Dogwood trees lined Charlotte Avenue in both directions, the white blossoms catching the last of the afternoon light in a way that makes even longtime Nashville residents stop and look. I did not stop, but I looked. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A message from Agatha, 6:41 in the evening, the same spare language she had used for 12 years. He came home 2 hours early, went straight to his office, hasn't come out. I read it standing by the driver's door. Good, I typed back. I got into the car, set the phone in the console, sat for a moment with the engine off looking at the dogwood trees through the windshield. The city moved around me in the ordinary fashion of a city that doesn't know what is shifting inside its buildings. The evening traffic, the restaurants filling up, the particular golden light that Nashville throws across its hills when April finally decides to arrive. Something was ending. Something else was about to begin. I started the engine and drove home. I want to be precise about this part. I did not contact Marlo Jeffries. I did not leak anything to the Nashville Business Journal. I did not make a single call to any reporter. Marlo Jeffries called me. What that meant was that the story had grown beyond my careful, quiet structure, and it had done so entirely on its own. She called on a Tuesday morning in mid-April while I was reviewing a lease renewal for a Hartwell subsidiary in Knoxville, an unknown Nashville number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Ms. Daly. My name is Marlo Jeffries. I'm an investigative reporter with the Nashville Business Journal. I've been following unusual financial patterns at Daly and Reed Capital for the past 6 months, and I was hoping you'd be willing to sit down with me. I set down the document. How did you get this number? Hi, I asked. I'm good at my job, she said. I called Rosalind before I called Marlo back. We met 2 days later at my office in the Gulch. Marlo was 39, with the particular attentiveness of someone who spent her career listening for what wasn't being said. She placed a recording device on the table openly and asked permission to use it. I said yes. Rosalind had advised me to. She had found the outline of something real, anomalies in quarterly filings, a Delaware entity that didn't match the firm's public records, 2 clients who had left in 2022 without explanation. She had the shape of it. She didn't yet have the interior. What I confirmed was limited strictly to information already filed with the relevant oversight bodies. Nothing more. What I gave her, more than facts, was confirmation that the shape she had traced was genuine. You've been patient for a while, she said when I finished. Yes, I said. I have. She published 9 days later. The headline, Daly and Reed, Capital Rising Questions Over Internal Transfers. By noon, the story had traveled well beyond Nashville's business community into the broader regional financial press. Marlowe had written it carefully, no conclusions ahead of the evidence, no language that could constitute defamation. It was the kind of piece that doesn't accuse so much as illuminate. Illumination, in financial journalism, is often more damaging than accusation. It leaves the reader to form their own conclusions from a very clear set of facts. I know all of this because Wren read it to me from her phone at Dozen Bakery on Charlotte Avenue on the morning it ran. She'd texted at 7:15. "Have you seen it?" No question mark. I was already in my car. When I arrived, she was in the window seat we'd used since graduate school coffee, half gone. Phone face up on the table. I waved it away when she held it up. "I've seen it," I said. We sat in silence for a moment, the comfortable kind that only exists between people who have known each other long enough that it doesn't need filling. Around us, Dozen Bakery ran its ordinary Thursday morning espresso machines. Something warm with cardamom, two men near the counter discussing a construction project on the east side. "How are you feeling?" Wren asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered. That was always our deal. Like watching something that was always going to fall. I said finally fall. Sad and also relieved. Sad? I didn't want it to be true, Wren. I set my cup down. There's a part of me that spent 5 years building a life inside something that was a lie, and that part is still grieving. For something that never existed. I paused. I just need this to be finished. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She didn't say anything. She never did at the moments when words would only get in the way. Outside, Charlotte Avenue was sharp with April light, the dogwood trees still in bloom. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number, Nashville area code. I looked at Wren. She raised her eyebrows. I answered. "Ms. Daly, this is Special Agent Thaddeus Grover with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I'd like to arrange a time to sit down with you." I set my coffee cup down quietly. "Of course, Agent Grover," I said. "Whenever is convenient for you." The call lasted 43 seconds. I put the phone down. Wren was watching me. "FBI," I said. She held my gaze. Then she picked up her coffee. "Okay," she said. Just that. Outside, the April light held steady over Charlotte Avenue. Nashville in spring has a particular way of continuing, regardless, unhurried, already moving toward whatever comes next. I was not there when they arrested Garrett Daly. I want to be clear about that. I had not planned to be there, and I did not want to be. Justice, in my experience, does not require an audience. What it requires is patience, paperwork, and the right people doing the right things at the right time. Agatha called me at 8:53 in the morning. She said exactly 4 words. "It's done. He's gone." I was in the kitchen when the phone rang. Not the office, not the car. The kitchen at Belle Meade, the same kitchen where I had sat across from Garrett at 7 in the morning while he read the financial news, and I poured coffee with steady hands after Agatha had placed 47 pages of transfer records on my desk. The same kitchen where I had poured 2 cups of tea at 11 o'clock at night and said, "Sit down," and watched him talk for 25 minutes about nothing while I made the most important decision of my life. The same kitchen where he had cooked dinner on a December evening and raised a glass of excellent wine to a good year while I held 34% of his company in a Delaware LLC he had never heard of. That kitchen, the one that had seen everything. I picked up on the first ring. "It's done," Agatha said. "He's gone." 4 words. That was all. In 12 years, she had never required more words than the situation actually needed, and this situation, she had correctly determined, needed exactly 4. "Thank you, Agatha," I said. "Of course," she said. She ended the call. I set the phone on the counter and stood there for a moment. Through the kitchen window, Nashville in May was doing what Nashville in May does. The dogwood blossoms already thinning from their April peak. The heat beginning its slow seasonal settle over the hills. The light coming in the particular flat, bright way of late spring mornings that have decided to be serious about warmth. An ordinary Tuesday. A city conducting its business. I sat down at the table. Agatha had told me later, not that morning, but a few days after, when I asked what it had looked like. 4 agents arriving at 8 o'clock. Garrett had been in a client meeting in the conference room. He was called to the front desk. He came out in his jacket, the one he wore for important mornings. She recognized it. Had seen it pressed and hung in the closet at Belle Meade for 4 years. He was handcuffed at the reception desk, while the staff stood in the hallway and did not speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. Whatever he was, Garrett Daly had always understood how to hold himself together in the rooms where it mattered. I thought when she told me this that it was the most accurate thing I had ever learned about him. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after the call. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I have been honest about everything else in this account, and there is no reason to stop here. I did not feel what people expect you to feel in a moment like this. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the particular sharp pleasure of a completed plan, the satisfaction of watching something you built do exactly what you built it to do. I felt still. A specific kind of stillness, the kind that arrives when a sound that has been running in the background for so long, you stopped registering it as noise, finally stops. And what remains is not silence exactly, but the absence of interference. Here is something I have not told anyone until now. Sitting at that kitchen table, I thought about Garrett Daly at 28 years old. Before any of this. Before whatever decisions he made that turned him into the man who kept a dissolution plan in a folder called Personal Do Not. Open, and spent 5 years building a structure designed to take from someone who had never given him a reason not to trust her. I thought about the man at the Vanderbilt gala who had said, "You're the only person I'm talking to tonight who isn't performing." And I asked myself honestly the way I had been asking myself honestly for the past year, in the quiet of my office and the space after difficult phone calls, whether any part of that had been real. I decided that it didn't matter anymore, not because I was angry. The anger had metabolized long ago into something more useful, into patience, into structure, into 89 pages and a Delaware LLC and 4 years of careful, invisible work. What remained was not anger, and it was not grief, and it was not satisfaction. It was simply the recognition that something had ended, that I was, for the first time in 5 years, on the other side of it. I was sitting with that recognition when Bennett called. "Saw the news," he said. His voice had the careful quality of someone who wasn't sure yet what version of me he was going to find. "You okay?" "Yes," I said. A pause. "Really, I will be," I said. It was the most accurate thing I could offer him, and he knew it, because he knew me well enough not to require more than accuracy. He said he would come by that evening if I wanted. I said I would let him know. We ended the call with the particular unspoken understanding of siblings who have spent their lives in a family that communicates in what is not said as much as in what is. Rosalind called at 10 o'clock. She had already spoken with the relevant authorities. The accounts associated with Daly and Reed Capital had been frozen as of that morning, the firm's operating accounts, the client fund accounts. The accounts linked to the Delaware shell structure that Norbert had helped build and then helped dismantle. And the personal accounts. All of them. Crestview Meridian's accounts were untouched. The entity had never appeared in any of Garrett's filings, had never been named in any shared document, and carried no connection to him that any court order could reach. It remained exactly where we had built it, separate, clean, and entirely mine. "Are you ready to begin the divorce proceedings?" she asked. I looked around the kitchen one more time, at the window with its May light, at the table where I had sat with 2 cups of tea and 25 minutes of meaningless conversation and the most significant decision of my life, at the counter where a 16-page postnuptial agreement had been placed, with the carefully rehearsed casualness of a man who believed he already knew how things would end. "Yes," I said. "Start tomorrow. I want everything clean." "I'll have the initial filings prepared by end of day," she said. Thank you, Rosalind. Get some rest, she said. She ended the call. I sat in the kitchen for a while longer. The house was very quiet. Outside, Nashville continued its Tuesday in the ordinary way of a city that has no idea what has just finished inside one of its kitchens. The light moved across the floor the way light moves in late spring, slowly, deliberately, as though it has somewhere to be, but is not in any hurry to get there. I stayed exactly where I was. I had been patient for a long time. I could be still for a little while longer. Garrett's post-nuptial agreement was by every technical measure an excellent document. His attorney had done meticulous work. It protected every asset Garrett had disclosed, every account he had named, every equity stake he had put on record. It protected him perfectly from the woman he thought he had married. It offered him no protection whatsoever from the woman he had actually married. That distinction turned out to matter considerably. The conference room was on the 22nd floor of a building on Commerce Street, 3 blocks from Rosalind's office, which I suspected was not accidental. The table was long and glass-topped, the kind that reflects the ceiling lighting in a way that makes everything look slightly more formal than it needs to be. The windows faced downtown Nashville, the skyline clear in the June morning light. Someone had arranged a coffee service at the side table. No one touched it. I arrived with Rosalind at 9:45. Garrett's attorney, a man named Warren, whom I had never met, who had the careful, composed expression of someone who had spent 30 years representing people in the worst moments of their professional lives, was already seated on the other side of the table. He stood when we came in. He offered his hand. I shook it. We sat down. I want to say something clearly about Warren before I describe what happened in that room. He was doing his job. He was doing it well under circumstances that did not permit him to win, and he conducted himself throughout with a professionalism that I respected. The situation he was managing was not of his making. The man he was representing had constructed it piece by piece, over 5 years, and Warren was now in the position of being the last person standing between that construction and its inevitable outcome. He understood this. It showed in the particular quality of his composure, the kind that comes not from confidence, but from the discipline of a person who has decided to be thorough, regardless of the result. He had prepared a presentation. He walked us through it methodically. The post-nuptial agreement, the asset protections it established, the provisions covering Daly and Reed Capital's equity structure, the clauses governing jointly held real estate, the formula for calculating proportional contributions to shared financial instruments. It was a well-organized document delivered by a capable attorney. Rosalind listened without interrupting. When he finished, she opened her own folder, a single-tabbed document precisely ordered the way everything Rosalind produced was precisely ordered, and began. She worked through it section by section. Her voice had the quality it always had when she was delivering information she wanted received accurately rather than emotionally level-measured, without inflection that might suggest she was enjoying herself or distressed by what she was saying. She was neither. She was simply working. The post-nuptial agreement protected every asset Garrett had disclosed. On this point, she said Warren was entirely correct. The document was well drafted, and the protections it established for its listed items were legally sound. The first issue was Hartwell Group. The post-nuptial agreement contained no reference to Hartwell Group, its subsidiaries, its assets, or its valuation, because at the time of signing, Garrett Daly had not known Hartwell Group existed. It had not been disclosed in the agreement because it had not been disclosed to him. Under Tennessee law, a post-nuptial agreement operates within the scope of its own disclosures. It protects what is listed. It cannot protect against what it does not name. Warren made a note. He did not argue the point. The second issue was Crestview Meridian LLC. The agreement contained no reference to this entity to the 34% minority stake in Daly and Reed Capital it held, or to the acquisition history that had established it. The agreement protected Garrett's 66% controlling interest in Daly and Reed. It had nothing to say about a minority stake held by a separately registered Delaware entity that was not a party to the agreement and had never been named in any of its schedules. Warren made another note. The third issue was the criminal proceedings. Under Tennessee law and applicable federal standards, provisions in a post-nuptial agreement that are directly connected to assets or conduct subject to active criminal prosecution are unenforceable as a matter of public policy. The provisions of the agreement governing Garrett's operating accounts at Daly and Reed, the same accounts implicated in the 47 transfers, the same accounts now subject to federal asset freezes, could not be enforced in the context of those same criminal proceedings. The document that was meant to protect those assets had, in the context of what Garrett had done with them, effectively voided the protection of its own most significant provisions. Rosalind closed her folder. Warren looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "I'll need to consult with my client," he said. "Of course," Rosalind said. "Take whatever time you need." She folded her hands. She waited. The consultation, conducted through a prison phone line with a court-appointed intermediary, took 40 minutes. I sat in that conference room and drank the coffee that had been sitting at the side table since 9:45, which was by then lukewarm and more bitter than I preferred. And I looked at the Nashville skyline through the window and thought about very little. I had done my thinking over the past year. This part was paperwork. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Garrett Daly's representative signed the divorce settlement on his behalf. Rosalind and I walked to the elevator together. In the hallway, marble floors, recessed lighting. The muffled sound of a city going about its business 22 floors below. She said the thing she had been building to all morning, in the particular understated way of a woman who chooses the right moment for the right sentence, and does not waste either. "His postnup protected everything he told us about," she said. "And nothing he didn't. Crestview Meridian not listed, therefore outside its scope. The 34% stake not listed. Hartwell Group assets never disclosed, therefore entirely outside the document." She paused. "He wrote a very good agreement to protect himself from the wrong version of you. He protected himself from the woman he thought I was," I said. "Yes," she said. "He forgot to account for who you actually are." The elevator arrived. We wrote it down in the comfortable silence of two people who had just finished something large. In the lobby, we parted ways. She had another meeting. I had nowhere to be. I walked out through the revolving door onto Commerce Street alone. No Rosalind, no Bennett, no Wren, no Agatha. Just me and the sidewalk and Nashville in June, which smells like hot asphalt and restaurant exhaust, and, if the wind is right and you are standing on the correct corner, something blooming from one of the planters along the avenue that the city puts out every summer and that no one ever seems to notice, except people who are paying a specific kind of attention. I stopped on the sidewalk. The sun was warm on my face. Traffic moved in the ordinary, purposeful way of a city mid-afternoon. From the coffee shop on the corner, the smell of espresso and something toasted drifted out through the propped-open door. Two women walked past me in conversation, laughing about something. A delivery driver double-parked with the particular confidence of someone who has done it 1,000 times. I pushed my sunglasses down. I stood there on the sidewalk on a June afternoon and exhaled fully, completely. The kind of exhale that only happens when something you have been carrying for a long time has finally been set down somewhere it cannot follow you from. Not happiness, not triumph. Something quieter than both. Something that for the first time in a long time felt like it actually belonged to me. I stood there for a little while. Then I put my sunglasses on properly and walked to my car. The announcement went out on a Thursday morning in October. Hartwell Group names, Celeste Hartwell as public-facing CEO. Wren called at 7:02, laughing and crying simultaneously. "They're going to feel so stupid," she said. "Some of them already do," I said. "Good," she said. "Let them sit with that." The Nashville business community reacted the way communities react when information reorganizes everything they thought they understood. Some people reached out immediately, professional warmth arriving the moment they realized they had been underestimating me. Some went quiet. A smaller number simply said, "I didn't know," which was the most honest response, and the one I respected most. Rosalind called the afternoon the announcement ran. She didn't say congratulations. She said, "The Crestview Meridian structure held perfectly. Everything transferred clean." Then she had another call. That was exactly right. I had moved into the Germantown apartment 6 weeks earlier, top floor, high ceilings, windows facing the Cumberland. On a Saturday in September, I moved a bookshelf 3 times before putting it where I actually wanted it. No one had an opinion. No one needed to be considered. It was exactly right. The family dinner was in November. Edmund poured the wine himself. When everyone had a glass, he stood. He was not a man who gave toasts. What he did was look at me across the plates and the candles and raise his glass. "To my daughter," he said, "who never needed anyone's permission." Elspeth held my hand under the table for most of the meal. Bennett sat across from me and mostly just showed up. That was always Bennett. That was always enough. Agatha and I had our last cup of tea at the Gulch on a Wednesday afternoon in November. The good tea, the kind she kept in a tin in the second drawer. 12 years, she said. 12 years, I agreed. "You never once asked me to do anything I wasn't proud of," she said. "Neither did you," I said. At the door, she paused. "The new assistant starts Monday." "Monday," I confirmed. She nodded once, verifying a logistical detail, and walked down the hallway with the same unhurried step she had always walked with. I listened until I couldn't hear it anymore. I met him at a dinner party in October, a friend of Bennett's. He asked a question and actually listened to the answer. We had coffee, then dinner, then several evenings that were simple and warm and unhurried. I am not going to tell you his name. This story is mine. The next part belongs to a different chapter. On a Tuesday morning in December, I was at Dozen Bakery window table, good coffee acquisition notes for a logistics company in Chattanooga. Outside, the Cumberland held what pale winter light there was in long columns across the water. I was working through a margin note when something surfaced unprompted. "Some women are born to sit in the back seat." Garrett's voice. Exactly as he had said it in the car that January evening, the tone of a man delivering a verdict he considered generous. I had looked out the window and said nothing. Nashville cold and glittering. The city I had spent 12 years building something inside of invisibly without a single announcement to anyone who might have looked at me differently. 15 companies, $2.3 billion, a 5-year plan that outlasted his, a Delaware LLC he had never heard of, a postnuptial agreement that protected him perfectly from a woman who didn't exist. He wasn't wrong. Some women are born to sit in the back seat. He just didn't know what I'd been building back there. My phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, Nashville area code, the kind that only calls from one kind of place. I looked at it for 3 seconds. Then I placed the phone face down on the table, picked up my coffee, and looked at the river. There are doors that don't need to be opened a second time. And there are stories that end not with a confrontation or a speech, but with a woman sitting alone at a window table drinking good coffee, looking at her city and feeling for the first time in a very long time completely herself. I turned back to the acquisition file. There was still a great deal of work to do. This was my story, a family drama story, a hidden assets divorce no one saw coming, and a silent revenge story that never announced itself until it was already finished. Don't be like me in the ways that cost me. Don't ignore the early warnings. Don't build someone else's empire and call it love. And if you ever find yourself inside a hidden assets divorce situation document, everything trust a good lawyer and never underestimate your own position. My honest opinion, the greatest family revenge stories are never about destruction. They are about reclamation. Every secret CEO wife story, every silent revenge story you have ever heard at the core, they are about a woman finding her way back to herself. I prayed once not for victory, just to find my way back. I believe I was heard. This family drama story ends quietly. Good coffee. December light work still ahead. Among all the family revenge stories worth telling, the ones that last are built on patience and the refusal to become someone lesser. Every secret CEO wife knows the most powerful move is the one no one sees coming. And every hidden assets divorce has a paper trail. Make sure it tells your story, not his. If this stayed with you, comment, share, and subscribe. You already know where to find me. Thank you for staying until the very end. Stories ahead blend fiction and truth, built to reflect, not to judge. Choose what serves you.
And that's where we'll end it today. I truly appreciate you watching. See you next time.